The desert was a map of heat and glare, a pale ocean that swallowed footstep and hoofprint alike. June Calder had been riding for so long that time felt unstitched, a loose thread dragging in the sand behind her. The sun burned straight overhead as if someone had nailed it there, and each breath tasted like it had been reheated in a stove. Her canteen knocked against her thigh with a sound that had turned cruel, hollow, hollow, hollow. Rowdy's limp had grown worse after noon. The gash along his hind fetlock had begun as a thin, bright smile cut by a shard of black rock the day before. Now it was a red mouth, sticky and slow. June had cleaned it with the last thin mouthfuls of water she could spare, then bound it with a strip from her shirt. Rowdy flicked an ear when she did it, as if to say he understood, as if to say, "Keep moving, girl." His eyes had a way of being steady when nothing else was. "Easy, June," said her own voice, startling her with how hoarse it had become. Slow and true like a well rope. Her father used to say that. Slow and true wins the bucket up. Fast gets you a face full of dust. The land had taught June to read it the way some read letters. She watched for the ragged language of wind, the arithmetic of buzzards, the small grammar of sage. Any of it might admit to a trickle, a seep a bend in rock where something green dared to be. Now there was nothing but a wide flat of sun that made everything shimmer and double. The horizon skated away whenever she tried to pin it down. A pair of buzzards were cutting circles to the east. June tried not to count that as a sign. Buzzards dealt in the certainty of endings. She needed a beginning. She should have cut the saddle loose and walked with Rowdy beside her, spared his leg. But when she set her boots on the ground, the sand grabbed them and refused to give them back. Each step felt like lifting a shovel full of earth with her thighs. So she stayed mounted and leaned forward, easing her weight over his shoulders on the bad leg's opposite side. Palms pressed flat to his neck to feel the rough heat of him. "You saved my life once," she whispered, because it felt like she needed reminding. "You keep saving it, and I promise you, Rowdy, I'll keep yours too." In her mind, she kept circling the same thought as circular as the birds she could turn back. She could find the rutted track that led to No Town and its yawning well and its stale beer and its mean beds. She could sell what was left of her gear pawn, her father's knife cough up a laugh for the men who spent their afternoons telling fortunes made of lies. She could go on the way she had for the last year alive, the way a lantern is alive in a room no one visits. Rowdy lifted his head and pricked both ears forward. June's thoughts blew away like smoke. "What is it?" she asked, trying to see what he did. Ahead the land rose in a low seam of paler rock. Beyond that, a darker line like a stitch pulled taut. It might have been a mirage. It might have been the kind of joke heat told when it wanted to see if you would cry. Rowdy set his feet without asking permission and angled toward it. The limp made a rhythm, 3 beats a hitch, 3 beats. June found herself breathing to it. The world simplified. It was just his shoulder beneath her hand, the slide of leather, the small grit in her teeth. She could have slept if not for how sleep felt like a promise she might not wake from. By late afternoon, the light changed in a way that made June's skin prickle. The wind that had been an oven breath carried the faintest thread of something else. She pulled her bandana down and tasted. The air still held dust, but under it there was a flavor like stone, with its tongue wet. "No," she said aloud, as if refusing hope might trick it into proving itself. "Not unless it's real." The land lifted under them at first like a broad back, and then like ribs. Pale rock deepened to a brown that drank the sun instead of spitting it back. A scrub juniper crouched in a crease. A fly buzzed at June's ear, with a laziness that belonged to places that had choices. Rowdy sucked the sound into his ears, curved his neck, and kept putting that bad leg down like a gambler keeps setting a coin on the table. The seam of rock became a ledge. The ledge held shadow. June felt herself getting lighter, either from relief or from the way the ground stepped up to meet them instead of sliding away. She swung down stiffly, legs pricking with sleeping needles and then pain, and led Rowdy by the rein. He followed at her shoulder like he always had, close enough that his breath touched the back of her arm when the wind paused. Up close, the ledge was not smooth. It gave itself away in fissures and slots. One such slot had a bottom that looked darker than it ought to. June crouched, put her palm there, and felt cool come up into her bones. She jerked her hand back and then laughed, a cracked and foolish sound that made Rowdy flick that ear at her again. "I know," she said. Don't spend it before it's in your pocket. They skirted the ledge until it dropped into a kind of crease cut long ago by angry water. The world changed letters there. The sky narrowed and the air turned soft. Somewhere so faintly June thought she invented it was a sound like torn silk being mended. Farther on, the crease turned a corner. Bushes with honest leaves appeared their green too fierce to be a trick. June broke a twig and pressed its wet heart against her tongue. It was bitter alive, not the chalky taste of a mirage. The path made itself. June did not think a word like path would belong in a place like this, but there it was. The earth worn a shade different by hooves and bare feet, and maybe wagon wheels once upon a time. The marks were old and patient. Whoever had used them had never been in a hurry, or else time had sanded their speed away. June looked down and saw her own boot prints fall in where others had, and the thought settled in her chest like a small bird. Someone else had believed in this seam of the world. Someone else had come here alive and left alive. Rowdy's legs shook, but he lifted his head higher. Nostrils flared the way he did when a good storm was a mile out and you could smell its belly. June laid a hand against his jaw and felt the vibration of a sound before she heard it, a low, endless murmur that did not belong to wind or the far speaking of men. It belonged to water falling from a height. She could have wept then, but the body has a practical way of saving its liquids when it needs them most. They rounded the last bend, and the land put its finger to its lips. Ahead, the crease opened into a pocket no one had earned the right to name. The pocket was a bowl of green and gray and white, and from the far side of it, a sheet of water slipped down a face of stone. Not a river's tantrum, nor a brook's laughter. Something between. The fall shredded itself into a mist near the bottom, and everything that mist touched was bright the way new coins are. June stood still, her boots braced on not sand for the first time in a long time, and listened to her heart hurry to match the water's measure. She led Rowdy to a trickle that ran out from the pool and cupped it in both hands, lifting it to his mouth before she let herself drink. He took it with a delicacy that always surprised her for how large he was. Then he shoved his muzzle into the trickle and drank as if he meant to pull the whole fall down through his throat. June's palms stung with the cold. She put them to her face, then to the back of her neck, and the world came into focus with a clarity that hurt. She knelt her knees, giving up with gratitude, and pressed her cheek to damp earth. The smell of it reached through time and touched the girl she had been years ago on her father's claim after the first good rain. Somewhere a bird stitched a line of sound across the pocket. Somewhere else a frog practiced saying its own name. When she could stand again, June looked past the fall and noticed what her eyes had skipped in the first rush, a faint track running away from the pool. The brush shyer there, stones arranged as if a hand had moved them. This was not a place discovered only by her. It was a place remembered. "We found it," she told Rowdy, who lifted his head with his lips dripping and breathed a long breath that steamed a little in the shade. He bumped her shoulder with his forehead in that particular way he did when he wanted her attention. She followed his gaze. Beyond the screen of alder and willow, the faint track tightened into a narrow throat between two shoulders of rock. The light that came from it was different, thinner edged with something like smoke. June listened. The water's murmur filled the pocket, but under it there was another sound, a careful hush like breathing on the other side of a door. She rested her palm on Rowdy's neck. "One more turn," she said. She felt his answer in the way the muscles beneath his hide gathered and waited. Together they stepped into the shadowed throat and the air changed. The throat between the rock shoulders narrowed until June could lay a palm on each side and feel cool grit print into her skin. Sound changed in there. Water became a long ribbon pulled through a fist. The outside world tamped down to a hush. Rowdy's breath echoed in the close space, a soft bellow steady despite the bad leg. The light ahead was thin and silver like the edge of a coin tilted to catch a last ray. The passage bent left, then right, as if it were remembering a dance, then uncurled without warning. June and Rowdy stepped into a second bowl larger and quieter than the first. Here the waterfall spoke only with its after voice, a long sleep talk, of water that had already fallen and was taking its time about getting anywhere else. Willow and alder ringed the pool. Farther back, where the ground pitched up gently toward the gray wall, stood a scatter of trees out of place for a country so hard, shaggy with narrow leaves that flashed pale when a breeze turned them. Cottonwoods June thought surprised by the memory. Her mother had loved their trembling. Beyond them, the earth flattened into a small meadow grass, brushed with yellow seed heads that leaned under their own weight. June let the reins slip, and Rowdy drifted to the water, lowering his head with reverence. She walked the rim of the pool boots, whispering in damp sand, and crouched to wash her face and the grit-caked bend of each elbow. The shock of cold sharpened the edges of her thoughts. When she looked up again, she saw it, a line in the grass where grass should have been careless. Not a path so much as a lean, like a part in hair. She stood, shook water from her fingers, and followed. The line threaded between the cottonwoods. Bark peeled in long, soft strips. June brushed one with her knuckles, and it came away like old paper. Under the trees, the light turned green. She could smell sap and something sweet underneath the faint, dusty sugar of fruit gone too long on a branch. The cabin waited there, the way a memory waits, halfway in the dark and halfway in what's left of the light. Its roof had slid down in two places and lay like a collapsed tent. Walls leaned the way tired men do at saloon doors. The windows were black eyes. Vines had found the corners years ago and climbed them the way children climb a willing back. Even from where she stood, June could see a stove's iron mouth yawning through a break in the wall. She put one boot on the porch. It answered with a creak that sounded like an old man deciding not to tell a joke. Inside, the air was cooler. Dust sat on everything, like a blanket that had been pulled up and forgotten. June moved carefully the floor, testing her with each step. A chair had fallen on its side and grown a small congregation of mouse droppings along one rung. A shelf listed and still somehow kept a clutch of jars whose lids wore a fuzz of rust. June set her palm on the stove. Cold, of course, but the iron felt like it had stored up the memory of heat and didn't want to let it go. On the stove's back plate, someone had scratched with a nail two letters and a mark that might have been a star or might have been a hand sneezed at the wrong time. JIS, either a name or the start of a word that never got finished. "Who were you?" she said quietly, not expecting an answer. Outside, Rowdy's hoof clacked against a stone, and then the shush of water took his sound for itself. She found a tin on the shelf behind the jars. It had once held cough drops or candies. The painted letters had been rubbed off by years of fingers. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had gone stiff and almost translucent, were seeds. Fat ones the color of buckskin, flat white ones, a scatter of little black shoulders. She rolled one in her palm and felt a softness under its hull, an animal sleep. "Look at you," she whispered, as if the seeds could feel pride. "Sleeping this long and still ready to try again." On a nail by the door hung a strip of leather looped into a figure 8 and cracked all across like dry river. June touched it and felt the shape wake in her hand. Hobbles for a horse. She thought of the cottonwoods in the meadow and imagined an animal standing there with its front ankles snugged together, swishing flies, waiting for a child to bring a handful of windfalls for its afternoon. The picture caught in her throat with a tenderness that hurt. She stepped back on the porch, and the light felt larger after the cabin's dim. Rowdy had drunk his fill and stood with one hind foot, cocked head, low eyes half closed. June could see the wound's edges cleaner, now that water and shade had both spoken their kindness. She knelt, unwrapped her shirt strip, rinsed it in the pool until the water ran less red, and bound the leg again, snug but not mean. Rowdy huffed the sound he made when he agreed to be fussed over. She pressed her forehead to his jaw for a moment. The heat there had turned from fever to the ordinary warmth of a living thing. "We'll stay the night," she said. She thought of fire and food. She had a heel of biscuit in her bag and a few dried peaches that had once been more promise than fulfillment. Here there were fallen branches under the cottonwoods, gray and dry as old men's beards. She gathered an armload and stacked them in a small teepee in a bare patch by the cabin's broken wall. Flint and steel slept in her pocket. 2 strikes gave her a shy spark, and a third gave her something that decided it wanted to grow. She fed it like a small animal, polite and frequent, until it had a voice. She did not build it big. The place seemed to ask for consideration. The smoke climbed through a tear in the roof and braided itself into the cottonwood leaves until wind took its top half and sent it off to tell a story someplace else. June warmed her hands and then tore the biscuit in two and gave Rowdy his half, which he accepted with the careful lips of a gentleman. She chewed her part slowly, not because it tasted good, but because it tasted like staying alive. As evening came down, so did a breeze that didn't belong to the big open. It ran its fingers over the meadow and turned it into one animal, moving all together. Swallows stitched dusk above the pool, their wings making small commas of sound. June felt the day pass out of her shoulders like a weight handed over. She listened to what the place would say when it didn't think it was being watched. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods and the wall behind the fall, a pocket of air talked when water hit it just right. The talk had the shape of words without the bother of meaning. June realized she was smiling into the dark, and let the smile be what it was. It had been a long time since her face had remembered how. Night gathered itself in the corners. June fed the fire twice more, then banked it into a red mouth that breathed without eating. She pulled her bedroll up against the cabin's wall, where the roof still kept the stars off, and she lay down with Rowdy's shadow within reach if she turned and stretched a hand. The world made small noises, the pop of sap in a stick, the click of an insect's brain, the far question of an owl. Water lay underneath all of it, patient as a heart. Somewhere before sleep took her, she remembered to be afraid. Not of the place, nothing in it wore the shape of threat, but of losing it. There were men who called anything they could find theirs and anything they couldn't break. There were boys who'd throw a rock through a window just to hear the sound. June turned on her side and watched the throat of stone dark as a closed eye. If someone came down that slit, they'd have to mean it. You couldn't drift here by accident. That was a comfort and not. She woke once to Rowdy's breath on her cheek. He had stepped close, shadow huge against the wall, and then stepped away again when she lifted a hand in the air and said his name low. The fire's mouth glowed steady. June closed her eyes and saw a different fire years ago and her father drawing with a charred stick on a slab, a triangle for a house, a line for a fence, a dot for a well. Everything's simple if you make it small enough. Dawn arrived as a pale rinse more than a color. June sat up into it, bones popping, and the chill climbed her shirt like small determined hands. The pool lifted a curtain of mist for a few minutes and then let it fall. She filled her canteen, splashed her face, and checked Rowdy's wrap. The wound was closed at the edges where yesterday it had looked like an argument. She laughed softly, a sound with no one to impress and so honest by default. The seeds in the tin had not stopped thinking of her. She thought of them. She thought of a garden scratched into the meadow's edge, where the soil had already decided to give of itself. She thought of staying long enough for seasons to mean more than words. She shook her head at herself. You're planning with a biscuit's worth of food in your bag, and then shrugged because you planned or you died exactly as you were this morning. June walked to the throat and stood just inside it where shadow reached up to her knees and sun warmed the rest. She crouched and looked at the ground for the language she trusted. There were her boot prints from yesterday, Rowdy's half-moon press, the blurred scribe of a fox or a small dog, and there, faint but sure, a man's boot heel, cut so clean it still kept its edge. Not new, not last night, but not a year old either. The wind had not yet had its way. June stood up slow. The valley breathed around her, patient and generous. She set a hand against the rock, felt the cold of it, the story of pressure and time. Then she turned back toward the cabin and the cottonwoods and the pool, and the horse who watched her with one ear and one eye. We'll keep it quiet, she said as if making a bargain. We'll keep it small. The water answered with its forever voice, and in it June heard both a yes and a warning. Morning made a cathedral out of the cottonwoods, every leaf a pane of pale green glass, the pool a low altar where light knelt. June stood with her boots in wet sand and said the promise out loud because words put into air behave better than the ones you keep in your head. Small, she told the water. Quiet, kind. Rowdy blew through his nose as if that covered his part. June smiled and set about making the promise into work. First, the throat. Where the passage narrowed, she dragged wind-fallen willow and alder into a loose lattice, weaving green into gray, so a casual eye would read it as tangle instead of doorway. She left gaps enough for a horse to thread through, if led close and slow, then brushed their prints with a branch until the ground wrote something more like deer than boot and shod hoof. She studied it the way she'd study a face she meant to trust. From 10 steps back, the knot path looked honest. From 30, it looked like the same nobody as the rest of the cliff. Good, she said softly, not to praise herself, but to settle the itch that comes from leaving a job half done. She went next to the cabin with an armful of dry boughs and her mind working the way her hands did, patient from the edges inward. A sparrow burst from the broken eave and scolded her from a cottonwood, insulted that the landlord had finally returned. June set the wood down, found a board that still believed in its own straightness, and braced it against the sagging wall. With a length of rawhide, she softened in pool water and then pulled tight with her whole back. It wasn't a fix so much as a kindness. Some things you keep standing one day at a time. The tin of seeds sat where she left it. She opened it and chose a few from each kind, the way you test a handshake to see if it belongs to an honest man. She cupped them in water in her palm until they darkened and let the first thirst out, then wrapped them in a scrap of damp cloth and nested the bundle in a splintered drawer she set under the cabin's east window, where the light sifted in gentle. The rest of the seeds she slid back into their oiled cloth, as if tucking children into bed. "Wake if you're of a mind to," she told them. "No hurry." Food came next. June walked the fringe where meadow became shade and found watercress standing bold in the rill that slipped away from the pool. The taste of it, clean and pepper, lifted the back of her head. A few yards on, she knelt to a patch of wild onion, pressed the stalks until they yielded with a sigh, and brought their white bulbs up like teeth. She set 2 snares with the last of her wire under brushy tunnels a rabbit had signed with small brown pellets, then went back to the pool with a safety pin, a bit of thread, and the stubbornness her mother used to call a family curse. You can't fish with a curse, her father had laughed once and showed her anyway. There were fish in the darker seam where the fall's breath met still water shadows that moved like thoughts you almost catch. June bent a thorn to widen the pin's gape, tied the thread double and baited it with a sliver of biscuit she had talked herself into saving. The first cast was a lesson in humility. The second got her nothing but the sight of a trout indifferently turning away. On the third, she held her breath exactly the way Rowdy did when he listened for distant thunder, and the thread drew tight like a line through the palm. The fish laughed with its whole body quick and bright, and June let it tire itself against her patience before she lifted it into her hands. It flashed once like a coin and stilled. She cooked it on a hot stone by the small fire with wild onion laid inside like a green ribbon. The first bite made her eyes close without permission. She gave Rowdy the last bite because he watched without asking, and the rules of kindness are like that: you make them small enough you can keep them every day. Once her belly had stopped thinking such loud thoughts, June took the knife her father had left her and walked a slow circle of the place to learn where it ended, and the rest of the world began. Behind the fall, there were shallow caves that felt like old throats. In the first, black soot sequined the ceiling where smoke had once been bored enough to stick around. Someone had melted pitch in a tin long ago and left its ring like a dark moon on stone. In the second, water dripped with a patience that turned the floor glassy. June cupped it and it tasted of stone and long memory. On a low shelf in the third, she found a cup hammered from a bit of tin, the handle wired back on by hands that knew how to coax a last life out of a thing. She held it, imagining a woman's mouth or a man's or a child's catching the same edge. She set it back exactly where it had waited and felt watched over instead of watched. A cottonwood near the cabin wore a strip of bark smoothed by fingers at a standing height for a child. June brushed it and felt a notch under her thumb, the small V where someone had once cut to mark a year taller than last. She had the urge to set her own thumb there, to measure a person who wasn't there anymore, and might not have a name now, and she did, and the ache of it was the good kind. Work kept the ache from staying. She laid a low corral of willow where meadow met rock, not to hold Rowdy. No rope in the world could hold him if he chose otherwise, but to ask politely where she'd prefer him to sleep. He obliged inside it at dusk, not because of the sticks, but because he read her like she was the weather. She cleaned his wound again, and the redness had retreated to a pink conversation instead of an argument. When she ran fingers down his leg, the muscle forspoke strength tomorrow. She kissed the triangular plane between his eyes and laughed at herself for it, and didn't take it back. The day warmed to the kind that narrows your thoughts to a shaded patch and a spoon. June sat on the cabin step carving a spoon from a scrap of cottonwood she'd convinced into being useful. Curls of pale wood fell against her thighs and stuck there. The valley's music, water-leaf talk swallows made a canvas for smaller sounds. A bee shouldering its way through a yellow flower. A squirrel's indignation at something that had no intention of changing its behavior. Far off the faintest jangle she could have mistaken for her memory, if not for the way it happened twice more, with the exact same space between. June set the half-spoon down and stood. She walked to the throat slow, as if hurrying would shake something out of place. The lattice held. The sand held. The world beyond it lay in its usual uncomforting bigness. No riders in sight. No dust tail. And yet the valley's skin had prickled, and June had learned to trust the body before the head catches up. She stepped through, moved 10 paces into the open, and crouched by a flat stone that sat like a tongue. On it lay what she almost missed because it belonged everywhere and nowhere. A torn scrap from a twist of tobacco, the paper thin as the skin on milk, stamped with a blue she'd seen on store tins, in towns that never liked her kind. She lifted it with 2 fingers. Not new, not wet, not from last rain whenever that had been out here, but not sun-bleached into forgetfulness either. She let the paper go and watched the wind take it with too much eagerness, like a child delivered late to a game. Back inside, she took a long breath that she let all the way out. "All right," she said to the valley, who continued not to be interested in her opinions. "We'll be smaller still." She made more rules than another oath in pieces she could carry: never take dead wood from the same place twice. Never cut a live limb that can be asked instead of told. Bank the fire low and mean it. No big smoke unless the sky itself is falling. Caches go in the 3rd cave. Food stores split between cabin and stone. Keep the tin cup where you found it. Say thank you where a person once stood, even if you don't know their name. In late light, she climbed the shoulder of the cliff on the valley's blind side, the one that looked out over open like a balcony few would think to build. From there, she could see the world's rough grammar washes like sentences. You couldn't finish spines of basalt like the backs of animals moving together. To the far south, a faint dust scribble bent east and then away. Metal ticked like a distant clock harness, spur a man careless with his own noise. 2, maybe 3 riders. They weren't aimed at her, not yet, but lines change. Men change. The only thing you can set your hand on and trust is the thing you've already done. She dragged a juniper branch behind her on the way back to smooth what she had written with her boots. At the throat, she brushed her tracks into the old fox script, then stepped through the lattice, restored a few leaves, and stood for a long moment, with her palm on the stone as if the valley were a big animal you could calm with touch. Night returned with its small choir and its one great organ note of water. June ate slowly trout and cress and the last of her peaches from the old world she'd ridden out of. She studied the drawer under the window and unwrapped the cloth. One of the black seeds had split its shirt. A pale nub nosed into the damp like a question mark, deciding to become a stem. "Well, look at you," she said, more surprised than proud. "I guess we're staying long enough for answers." Rowdy's shadow moved at the doorway, big and easy. June lay down under the mended corner of roof and let the day fold itself up. She thought of the scrap of tobacco paper, the blue dye, the buckle tick she'd heard far off. She thought of the valley asking for quiet, like a church asks for hats off. She let fear stand beside her long enough to make a plan, then asked it to wait at the door. Tomorrow she'd split stores, shift the fire pit 2 feet to confuse a nose, carry water to a spot where grass would green suspiciously nowhere near the pool, and send a thirsty man to a dead end. She'd learn the cliff's face better and name it to herself, cracks like the mouths of old stories. A ledge like a sleeping dog, a pocket where swifts turned dusk into calligraphy. "Small," she said again, almost asleep. "Quiet, kind." The water kept its own counsel and went on falling. Somewhere inside that sound, a seed decided the world deserved another try. June woke to the particular quiet that means nothing is hunting and nothing is hungry. The pool let a small veil lift and fall. Swallows cut it into ribbons with their wings. Rowdy's bad leg took her weight when she pressed, then set it down clean. The skin at the cut had sealed to pink. She said "good boy" into the hollow of his ear and felt the way his breath changed to carry the words somewhere he kept useful things. Work first, because work lays a floor for thinking. She pushed the fire pit 2 feet and brushed the old ash into a dozen places until every nose in a mile would have to choose wrong 11 times before it chose right. She carried bucket after bucket to a bare patch well away from the pool and let a green square rise where any thirsty stranger would swear a spring was near. She dragged a dead limb along a faint side game trail, to lay a story about deer that didn't exist. Small lies to protect a large truth. The drawer under the east window gave her the smallest miracle. Two black seeds had shrugged their shirts aside and pushed pale hooks into the cloth, seeking down. She laughed out loud an unbeautiful, honest sound and whittled 2 scoops from a cottonwood plank. Little cradles she filled with soil from a place that felt ready to be generous. She set them near the threshold on a shelf of light and smudged a fingertip across the dirt, the way some folks cross their hearts. Snares took a rabbit before noon. June thanked it quick and low-skinned and gutted with the clean motions her father had taught the hard way. One lesson badly done and hunger sits on your table laughing. She set bones to boil with wild onion and cress and the last 2 dried juniper berries from a pocket she'd forgot. The broth had a sorrow to it that made you grateful you hadn't died yesterday. Behind the fall, the third cave held like a hand. She split stores the way she'd promised: a jar of fat, a twist of salt wrapped in oilcloth, a strip of jerky, a clutch of onions whose hair would dry and braid. She tucked them into shadow on a ledge where a cool breath ran, then chalked a mark low on the wall where she alone would look: a sideways thorn, a sign to herself, this shelf full, the next one most. She might have counted the day good and called it, but the world hates a completed list. The valley pricked her skin again in the afternoon, that small lift of hair that says someone else's story has entered your room. She set down the spoon she was carving and stood. The throat lattice still looked like the kind of mess no man would volunteer to squeeze through, but a green twig near the bottom had been snapped and not by her. Sap showed on the break like a wet eye. June stepped lightly into the slot, every bootfall brushed behind with a willow switch. Outside, the wash lay like a chalk line. The sky was a flat blue hammered thin. 200 yards out, near a black rock shaped like a sleeping dog, the sand kept the print of a boot heel with a nick in it. She squatted and laid her finger in the nick. Same size as the heel she'd seen yesterday, same shallow bite at the outer edge. The wind had not yet read it aloud, which meant the man had passed near since morning. She didn't go farther. There was a kind of courage that looks like marching toward the thing that might kill you, and another kind that looks like giving the thing more room than it knows what to do with. June chose the second and slid back into the valley, shoring the lattice, resetting the branches, letting the place become uninterested in offering a doorway. She spent the last of the light learning the cliff's face the way a seamstress learns the back of her own hand. There was a shelf she could crawl along that took her from the cottonwoods up to a crease where she could see the open, while remaining only a rumor to anyone out there. Lying on her belly in powdery stone, she watched the wash draw a long, straight breath. Far south, a curl of dust. 2 riders, maybe 3 again. They moved the way men move when they are letting their horses do the thinking. No urgency, no straight aim at anything but forward. When she climbed down, Rowdy met her halfway with the look he wore when he wanted to be the taller one at the conversation. She scratched his chest where sweat had dried to salt map. "We are not hunted," she told him, and heard the question inside the period. Yet, that night she built the fire small enough that it told no one where it lived. The rabbit broth cooked to a sweetness that you only get when patience and bone agree to forgive each other. June ate and then sat with her back to the cabin wall, where the roof still kept the stars off, and stitched a tear in her shirt by firelight with nettle thread she'd worried out of cordage. The needle moved. The water spoke. Rowdy dreamed and his feet pricked at nothing. The whistle woke her a little after moonrise. 2 notes quiet, spaced the way a man spaces sound who doesn't intend to startle, even if he does intend to be heard. Not a bird, not a coyote. Human, yes, but more like a question than an announcement. June slid into her boots without standing. Her hand found the rifle with the sort of ease that means you have practiced more than you have slept. She pushed a coal with a stick until the fire made the kind of dark that shows you what is actually there. The whistle came again, a little farther from the throat now, as if the man who made it respected a threshold he hadn't been invited to cross. She didn't answer. The silence between 2 people's breaths tells you more than the words sometimes. Rowdy lifted his head in the doorway. June laid a palm to his muzzle and felt the steady of him. The 2-note questions sighed once more, and then the night knit itself back together. She sat with the rifle across her knees until the cottonwoods began their dawn shiver. In the morning she left a reply any child of this country would understand. On a flat stone at the throat she laid a figure made of willow, a man with his hands open a strip of blue calico, tied where the neck would be. The blue was the last of the ribbon her mother had once braided into June's hair for a fair she had not enjoyed. Under the figure, she set 3 pebbles in a row, meaning wait, meaning peace if you know how to spell it. She went about her day without pretending she could forget the stone. She lifted the tin cup in the cave and drank stone-cold water and said thank you twice. She set a new snare, this one, with a breakaway knot because taking small lives asked for mercy even in the doing. She listed the rules again without saying them out loud. And when the sun stood where it made shadows into underwriting, she walked to the throat. The willow man was gone. In its place, a ring braided from horsehair lay on the stone, small enough for a woman's finger, and tied off with a single blue thread. Beside it, someone had set 2 pebbles and left the third upside down. The language of it was simple as a folded blanket, I heard you. I can be patient. This place reads true. June's hand went to the ring before she could tell it not to. The horsehair was sorrel and black, the sort you get when you own one animal your whole life and love it enough to keep what falls from its mane. She slid the ring onto her smallest finger because the world occasionally asks you to be a girl in order to be a guardian. It fit in the way good luck does, unexpected and exact. There was a paper too tucked under the pebbles. Not a tobacco scrap this time, but a slice from the inside of a flour sack. Fibers soft with age written on in pencil, softened by grease. The hand was neat as fence pickets. If you found the fall, you know how to listen. If you know how to listen, you know how to keep quiet. Follow the cottonwood with 2 scars. There's a door under the oldest root. J+ has kept it for bad seasons. Leave it better than you find it. June read it 3 times and felt the letters go off in her bones like small fireworks. J.S. The marks on the stove back. She looked up at the cottonwoods. 2 of them stood together like a couple at their own wedding. One wore twin lightning scars down its north face, long white zippers puckered shut by time. She went to it, knelt where the earth gathered, and let the dead leaves tell their brittle story. Her fingers found wood that didn't belong to a tree, a plank fitted to a frame and pinned with rusted strap hinges. She dug with her knife hilt in her hands until the dirt gave up its hold. The plank heaved like a stubborn thought and then lifted. Cool came up like a seller's breath, and with it the smell of apples that aren't there anymore. June coughed, laughed, wiped her face with the back of her wrist. Steps led down into a room no bigger than a stall. Walls cribbed with old barn boards, air holding the careful hush of men who built things to last. Shelves lined the far wall. Some held jars with their lids long gone gentle. Inside, one light tapped itself against amber liquid peaches, impossibly kept bright by wax and luck. A roll of oilcloth tied with twine lay in the corner. She lifted the roll. Inside, a map scratched on the back of a grocery broadside. The valley drawn as an oval, the throat as a crack, the caves as 3 black coins. At the top, a note in that exact same neat hand. If you are kind, this place will feed you. If you are careless, it will leave you. We took our turn. Take yours. June stood under the earth, the paper in her hands. The horsehair ring biting her finger lightly as if to say, don't drop this. The sound of water filtered through boards and dirt and the bones of the world. When she climbed back into daylight, the cottonwoods seemed to look down and decide she'd done the polite thing. Rowdy waited ears forward as if he'd been the one to write the note just to see if she could read. June set the door back, smudged the earth to its old forgetfulness, and sat with her back against the twin-scarred trunk. The whistle came again from the wash. Not close. Not asking. Just letting a presence be known the way you let a dog hear your boots from a ways off so it won't startle when you appear. June stood, brushed soil from her palms, and walked to the throat. You found it then, a voice said from the bright side of the lattice, low and woman-tired. And you didn't set it on fire. June kept her rifle pointed at the dust and her eyes on the speech. I found it, she said. And I mended a corner. Good, the voice said. Silence hung its hat between them for a long second. Then may I come in slow? Rowdy blew a breath that could have meant yes, or could have meant I'm watching either way. June drew 3 twigs aside from the lattice. Slow and small, she answered, or not at all. The woman came through the lattice like mist-fine seams, one shoulder at a time, palms open, head tipped the way you do when you meet a dog with its own opinions. She was longer in the years than June, but the kind of age that didn't apologize, sun-browned cheekbones shaved lean by wind hair, laid into a gray braid thick as a lariat. Her hat was sweat-shined at the band. Her boots were good and quiet. At her back waited a mule the color of rain that can't make up its mind. Rowdy's ears went halfway forward and halfway not. June kept the rifle low and the muzzle at dirt, a language that says, "I can be reasonable." The woman nodded at that like a teacher finding a figure set down clean. "Name's Sal," she said as if the syllable had been cut from something longer and kept for company. Short for a longer story. "You." June said. Her mouth felt dry again, but not the way the desert does it, more like a dry. "You get when two roads meet and forget who goes first. This is Rowdy." Sal looked at the horse first, which is the right way round. "That leg's mending," she said, approval tucked under the words like a thin coin. To Rowdy, she added, "And you know you did a fine thing." Rowdy's eyes softened, then remembered to be a horse again. They stood in the shade while the water went on talking. Sal didn't fill the quiet with nonsense. She used it to look at the lattice at the sand brushed into a deer's mind. At the small fire pit shifted just so. When her eyes came back to June's hands, she seemed satisfied that the place had been seen by someone who intended to keep seeing it. "You left the Willow Man," she said, "and you took the ring." "I did." June lifted her smallest finger. The horsehair had warmed to her by now, sitting there like it had been made at sunrise for this exact hour. "You made it, a long time back," Sal said. "From a mane I miss." That landed in the air between them and didn't need help. "J.S.," June said, nodding toward the cabin without moving. "On the stove. The map in the root cellar. The note." Jonah and Sal answered. "We spelled plain." She touched the cottonwood trunk with two fingers, the way a person tips a hat at a gravestone without wanting to make a fuss. "He's gone a while now. The valley treats a widow like a thing. It knows which is a help." "I'm sorry," June said, "because some sentences you say, even when they can't change a damn thing." Sal's mouth thinned, then let go. "We didn't build the valley." She said, "We only learned to ask. Same as you've started." She didn't ask June how she'd found it, and June didn't explain. Both of them understood that a true path tells on itself if you try to put it into words. Instead, Sal unslipped a small sack from the mule and set it on a flat rock. She folded back the top and lifted a jar the color of sunlight remembered through glass. Peaches suspended as if time had been asked to sit down and behave. A wax seal grew a pale rind. Sal slid a thin blade around it, lifted the cap, and the smell rolled out August in a room built by water. "We only open these when a place meets a person," Sol said, "and the person remembers to knock." June didn't reach. She let the invitation make itself, and then nodded her thanks. Sal passed her a spoon hammered from a belt buckle. The metal thinned by years into something tender. They ate one peach each slow. Syrup ran their wrists and salted the dust where it fell. After Sal set the jar back with two fruits still floating inside. "For when a day needs telling, it was worth it," she said. They sat on their heels facing the throat. The mule switched its tail like a metronome that refused to keep a beat. Rowdy dozed head low, a foreleg cocked in trust. "You left 3 stones," Sal said. "Wait, peace, patience. Most folks who nose in at the mouth leave a fire or a shout." "I don't like being found when I'm not the one doing it," June said. She told Sal about the dust scribble, the careless jangle, the boot with a nick, the 2-note whistle. She didn't mention fear exactly. She didn't need to, any more than a person needs to tell you, water's wet if you're both sitting next to it. Sal listened the way someone listens when their hands are busy tying a knot only their grandmother taught them. "They're not mine," she said of the riders, nor anyone I'd invite to a christening. "Boys from the dry side, most likely. The dry teaches a man to want more than he can carry." Jonah used to say thirst leaves fingerprints. "Your whistle," June asked. Sal nodded. 2 notes means I'm not here to take. 3 means don't come closer unless you want trouble. 1 long means need. She turned her head. "You set your own whistle if it suits. But teach it to the valley first. It doesn't like to be startled." They walked the cottonwoods together, Sal's palm reading bark and shadow like braille. She showed June a braid of willow that made a more convincing snarl at the tight of the throat, and a trick with ash that scatters scent low and sideways. At the caves, Sal lifted the tin cup and washed her hands before touching the shelves, which felt like a prayer that had grown up on the practical side of the river. We kept this shelf for lean days, she said, tapping the chalk thorn and adding a second mark that meant today. We kept this one for company that deserved to be fed. She added, you decide who deserves. Her mouth twisted. If judgment comes hard, the valley will just do it for you, and you won't like how it decides. They checked Rowdy's bandage. Sal dug in her sack and brought out a bundle of yarrow and a square of lamb's ear, both dried and clean. The one draws heat, the other keeps it from talking back. She said, showing June how to set them so the skin could close without forgetting how to breathe. Rowdy tolerated being the center of instruction, as if he understood a lesson about him had a way of saving other lives later. When the sun climbed to where it shouted at everything, they made shade near the cabin and traded stories that were only as long as they needed to be. Sal told about Jonah without telling about death. You could hear the missing word anyway, and wouldn't have placed it better if she'd tried. June told about a father who taught her to read wind and arithmetic her hands could carry. Neither of them told about the nights they had accomplished by not crying, but the valley had heard those 100 times and didn't require another go. From the blind shelf on the cliff, they watched the open from their bellies, two halves of a single stillness. The dust scribble moved a little closer and then away, as if the men had thought a thought and lost it. Sal ran a finger along the rock, leaving no line. They'll keep circling, she said. Hunger goes in loops. We starve it by offering it other shapes. I set a green square out yonder, June said. No water under it. Enough to fetch a thirsty fellow toward a bad guess. Sal smiled without any teeth. Small lies to save a large truth, she said. That's the valley's grammar. Afternoon softened. They walked back down with the day on their shoulders like a blanket, just heavy enough. Sal stopped at the throat and set two pebbles upright, a new mark, and looked at June until June translated it for herself. We share watch, June said. You at the wash line, me at the cliff. Every third evening we trade. Sal's nod was a thing you could wear under your shirt for luck. You can call in need, she said. One long note. I camp far enough that men who smell me think I'm a rock. Near enough I can be here before a bad idea gets legs. Will you stay, June asked, or do you belong to a stripe of road? Sal looked past June at the cottonwoods as if to ask permission. The mule says we move tomorrow, she answered after a beat. I listen to smart animals, but I circle. My bones don't like beds that don't know me. They ate the rabbit broth, and afterwards Sal reached into the root cellar and brought up a folded bit of flour sack with a different hand's writing on it. Large, a little sloppy, sure in its own way. Jonah's, you'd guess if you'd been listening. It said in letters that leapt. If you found this place and it found you back, you are family for as long as you remember what family's for. Sal didn't pass the scrap to June. She held it where both could see, then put it back with a care that made the board seem to stand straighter. They set the plank, smudged the soil, unwrote their hands. Evening dropped its coins into the pool one by one. Rowdy settled in the willow corral without pretending he was held. The mule chose a patch with its butt to a rock, learned by years. Sal stood at the throat with her hat in her hands and said something too low for anyone to hear, which is the right volume for talking to water. June stood beside her and made her own small oath again, this time with a second mouth on the promise. Small, June said. Quiet, Sal added. Kind, they said together, which made the cottonwood leaves shiver like a laugh you're pleased to have earned. The two-note whistle came from far out, the kind that warns the dark. You'll be walking through it careful. Sal tipped her head, measuring distance in sound, the way a crow measures it in wing beats. We're not alone in the world, she said. But this bowls our say. They banked the fire into red thought. June lay with her shoulder to the cabin wall, listening to the water keep the hour. Sal slept sitting, hat brim, low, hands folded on her belly, a person who knew to make herself into a stump when night goes looking for a shape to bother. Sometime past midnight, the valley breathed once large and slow, and both women breathed to match it without waking. When morning came for them, the mule had already decided the road. Sal rolled her bed in 3 motions, tied it with a hitch neat as handwriting, and stood with her hand out. June took it. The shake lasted the exact length of trust that has to keep lengthening itself day by day. 2 notes and 3 of bad. 1 long for need, Sal said again, which was less instruction now than blessing. Peaches on the second shelf when you want to mark a thing. Leave it better. I will, June said. The words were small. They fit everywhere. Sal eased back through the lattice. The mule went where she pointed it without pretending the choice was hers. At the bright edge, Sal half turned. Jonah used to say the valley doesn't save you so you can hide, she said. It saves you so you can guard something worth bringing others into when they're ready not to break it. How do you know when that is, June asked. Sal touched the brim of her hat. You'll hear it, she said. Same place you heard the water. They were gone into the wash, their prince telling a story only the wind would read. June rebuilt the lattice, brushed the sand, and stood with her palm on the stone. The day opened like a book she'd been glad to carry. Rowdy nosed her pocket for nothing in particular. June laughed and scratched his jaw, and then went to lift the tin cup to thank the water to start the work again. Small, quiet kind. Days learned their own handwriting. The seeds in the scoop shrugged off their sleep and split the dirt with pale hooks that stood considered the idea of up and committed. Rowdy's wound turned from a story told in red to a faint pink rumor. June moved through the valley as if it were a room with many doors that all knew her name. Each morning she touched the tin cup, drank the stone cool, and thanked the ones who had kept a shelf cleared for anybody decent enough to knock. From the blind shelf high on the cliff, June watched the Open's grammar go on about its old sentences. Some afternoons the wash lay empty as a licked spoon. Others, a dust scribble, wandered the horizon and lost interest before it gathered itself into threat. She sent 2 notes into the heat on the second evening. I am here, and I am not your problem. And the day answered with nothing more than swallows, cutting dusk into clean pieces. On the third day, hunger tried a sharper shape. 3 riders drifted in from the dry side, the sort of men whose hats have forgotten shade. One rode a sorrel with hips like a saw's missing teeth. One rode a dun mare who looked like she'd once been a good idea. The third walked beside a small bay that wore every mile in its knees. They found June's green square, the waterless lie she'd fed with buckets, and took its promise like men who had mistaken a mirage for an apology. The one on foot knelt, scooped dust into his palm, let it run back out, and swore as if the ground had done him personal wrong. June lay on her belly with her chin on her fists and watched without letting her face decide anything. The sorrel's rider had a boot heel with a nick in it, the same nick, the same heel that had pressed a bite into the Sanday's back. He was narrow and knotted, and his jaw worked a chaw the way a dog works an old rope. The dun's rider was younger, lashes sooted with road, a softness still somewhere under the grit, the sort of man loses on purpose or it gets taken. The one walking had shoulders like a doorframe. He kept his hat tipped against the sun, the way a man tips his hat against anybody's eyes. They didn't find the throat. They didn't find the lattice. The valley's face kept its plainest expression on. The men camped a mile off under a rock shaped like a giant's knuckle. Their fire small and miserable. Their talk the kind that pulls words apart to see whether any of them are coins. After dark, a whistle came thin as a fishbone. 2 notes from the wash, the courtesy of a person saying I'm within earshot. Sal sent back 2 notes from far south, a patient friendly that landed like a moth. There followed a stretch of silence you could have balanced a coin on. Then the night decided to be night again and kept its own counsel. Morning June left a reply to the world that meant help without confession. At a dead mesquite stump a quarter mile from the false green, she set a gourd full enough to turn a man around and not full enough to make him greedy. Beside it she laid 3 pebbles and turned the middle one on its side, which in this country reads, mind your next step. With a twig she drew a line in the dust toward a notch that led away from the valley and toward a seep that hadn't been good in years, but was good enough now thanks to a spring slant in the small, unadvertised labor of women who carry water at dusk. Back in the bowl, June told her hands to do old work, mending a crack in the stove door, with wire prying a nail out of a board with 2 patient motions. But the day went taut anyway, the way a line goes taut when a fish that isn't on your hook cuts by and takes your breath as payment. By noon from the shelf, she watched the 3 men find the gourd and argue over whether a gift from nowhere had teeth. The younger one drank without performative suspicion and then passed the gourd. The nick-heeled man called him Pike because he looked like a stick you'd use to test dark water. Sipped, spat, sniffed the dust as if it had lied to him personally and pointed his chin at the notch June had drawn. The doorframe shoulders nodded. They went that way. June slid back, brushed her prints with a juniper switch rebuilt. The lattice smudged the throat until it looked bored. She didn't tell her heart to settle. Hearts don't listen to orders spoken in a single voice. Toward evening, a heat-lightning stack built itself over the far ranges. Wind came down the wash with a new coin's edge. Birds lowered their voices. The valley lifted the hair on June's arms and said in a language she barely knew, "Ready yourself." One long note shivered the slant light knee drawn out of the wash in a tone that forgot pride. June was already moving before Sal's answer rose from the south. Another long strand of sound that had the shape of coming. At the lattice, June left the rifle propped the way a person leaves a broom where they can find it after the storm. She slid into the slot and let the wash's hot breath tell her where to put her boots. At the giant's knuckle rock, the younger rider was down on one knee beside the bay, whose legs had given the sort of notice a horse gives when it has done everything it can and will do no more. The boy's hands hovered useless with wanting. The bay's breath came fast and flat. A rattler had found the only shade worth quarreling over and been convinced to leave its opinion in the mare's pastern. June didn't step into the circle. She left a canteen at the rock's lip close enough to claim without any argument. She set a square of lamb's ear, and the yarrow Sal had left her in a strip of clean cloth, and she laid 3 pebbles in a line that said, "Do this first." The boy's eyes, too old and too green, flicked to the gifts then to the dark, where June had been a second before, and he nodded at nothing very hard. Pike swore at the air and threw his hat, at which the door-frame-shouldered man said a quiet word, the sort that has a way of making other words sit down. Lightning rumbled like heavy furniture being dragged upstairs. June slid back through the lattice and sent one long note into the bowl. "Need yes, but not ours." And Sal answered from the ridge north with a 3-note braid, "Bad near you," which June answered with 2 notes shaped like a no not yet. Then they went about the small business of making big trouble, look for different doors. Before the rain reached them, they gave the wash an argument it wanted to win. Sal worked the far notch with a mattock she carried like a third shoulder, knocking loose 3 wedges of rock she and Jonah had always kept half-freed just for this sort of day. June dragged brush where it would catch the first rush and shunt it toward the false green, that square of lie that would become for an hour the truest place in a mile. When the storm broke, it did it with a sound like a barrel stove kicked over by an angry season. Water fanned off the cliff in 6 extra sheets, turned the throats outside into a slick. Nobody could arrive by accident and took the wash's shape in its hands and made it a different story. The camp at the knuckle went from ash and bedroll to a moving, kicking confusion of rope and men and horse in 10 breaths. June and Sal stood at the edge of their world and watched without needing to feel any particular joy about it. They didn't wish pain. They wished turning. The water obliged. Pike grabbed for a pack that decided it liked the river. The door-frame shoulders grabbed the boy by the back of his shirt and hauled him onto the dun, whose better days were behind, but not forgotten. The bay, bless her, found a rock and a will and stood above the water, with her head low and her ears pinned and lived. Then the wash went from fast to faster, and the men went with it, because sometimes the only language anybody understands is the one wind shouts with rain. By the time the storm gentled, the camp had become a memory, the wash carried to a different county. The 3 men stood where the knuckle made a lee slick, as otters, looking smaller than men, should look under a sky that has learned to argue. Pike's hat had become a proposal in mud. The boy held the bay's halter forehead, pressed to her cheek, speaking into her ear the kind of words horses keep. That night the dark came clean, washed of dust, the stars unscratched the pool. A sheet that fit exactly. June banked the fire to a thought, laid the tin cup where the cave would remember it, and slept in the honest exhaustion of someone who has moved water where it needed moving. Rowdy dreamed with his feet twitching. Lightning worked its last problems out beyond the ridge, mumbling to itself. Morning brought small signs like letters you can only read once you've been taught. At the throat on the flat stone lay June's canteen full, the lamb's ear and yarrow folded back inside clean cloth, the horsehair ring she wore still on her finger, and a scrap torn from a tobacco twist with a sentence scratched in pencil that had been sharpened with a knife. The hand was young and tried to be neat. "Thank you. I owe a quiet I can keep." 2 pebbles stood upright, the 3rd lay on its back. "Patience, but do not wait for me." Beside them, carved into the stone with the point of a spur, an X that had no business being so neat. Pike's mark sure as a man learning to write his own name late, and loving the look of it. Under it, another mark, a curved line like a river that meant I'll circle, which was either a promise or a warning, and the difference would eat a person if they let it. Sal came from the south with the look of someone who'd slept in a tree and considered it as good as a bed. She lifted the scrap, read it, breathed out slow. Boy's worth saving, she said. The other one's a hunger with a boot on. What do we do? June asked, which wasn't the same question as, how do we stay hidden anymore? Sal tipped the brim of her hat toward the cottonwoods. We stay small, we stay quiet, we stay kind. And we remember Jonah's saying, the valley didn't save you so you could vanish. It saved you so you could choose who deserves to belong. Through the afternoon, they prepared for a thing that might not come if they were lucky and would definitely come if they were lazy. June shifted Cash's food to the second, cave tools to the first, the peaches to a shelf no hand would find without listening. Sal walked the wash and planted the sort of lies that keep truth safe. Hoof marks turned away by a man who didn't exist. A broken twig that pointed toward a dead end. A blue thread tied where only a person who knew blue meant hush would look. When the light went copper, a single long note rose from the open, the sound a person makes when he has tried being nobody and found it beyond him. June and Sal both lifted their heads. Rowdy moved to the lattice and stood as if he had opinions. Wind came down the throat and smelled like wet grass and a decision. Need, Sal said. Yes, June said. They left the rifle where a broom should go when weather is coming, and together they stepped into the throat slow and small, the valley at their backs like a large animal that trusted them to return with the right kind of story. The long note hung in the wash like a thread a person had thrown and hoped would catch. June and Sal stepped through the lattice together, small and slow, as if the air itself had nerves. Rowdy stayed at the throat ears, forward the shape of him, filling the doorway, the way of faith does when you need it to. They found the boy at the giant's knuckle hat, off hands open, standing beside the small bay, whose eyes had gone glassy with long pain and sudden luck. The snakebite had yellowed and loosened along the pastern. Lamb's ear and yarrow had done what they could. He'd kept the wraps wet. He looked like a person learning how to hold still around a miracle. Ma'am, he said to Sal first, which told June nearly everything. Then to June's softer iota quiet. I kept it. He held out June's canteen full. He kept his eyes level, respect without the scrape. Up close, he was younger than fear had made him look all edge and bones, trying to decide where man ends and boy begins. There was soot on his lashes. His mouth had the set of someone who had told himself a dozen times that morning that he wouldn't cry, and had mostly kept the bargain. Name, Sal asked, not unkind. Reed, he said. The way he said it sounded like he was reminding himself. That leg will hold June, said of the bay, because you must hand people a true sentence. They can put in their pocket. She'll walk slow, and she'll live to like it. Reed's shoulders dropped the distance of one hard year. He touched the mare's cheek. I'm obliged, he said. He didn't say to what. The valley heard thank you anyway. Where's the other two? Sal asked, and the boy's eyes skated once toward the east as if he had been avoiding the direction, even in his thinking. Pike went on, he said. He's got a nose for water like a coyote and a way of wanting that makes men thirsty just to stand near. Cal, he meant the door-frame man. Cal took the dun and followed slow. Cal's the kind that hears a word once and keeps it even if he never liked school. Sal nodded as if she'd been introduced to both men properly. You have business with either, she asked Reed. I had, he said. I'm starting to rethink the shape of it. He brushed his sleeve across his mouth, sheepish without apology. I ain't hungry for Pike's sort of hungry anymore. Good, June said simply. She lifted her hand and drew in the dust with one finger, 3 pebbles in a line, the middle on its side. There's a seep west by the notch, she said. Not enough to brag on. Enough to keep a man alive who knows how to keep himself small. I can do small, Reed said. The way he said it had decision in it instead of shame. From somewhere across the open came a 3-note whistle, far and thin bad, near me. Pike's voice rose after not a whistle at all, a string of words you don't teach children, and a hoarse laugh that had the truth of a wound in it. Reed's jaw went tight. He'll be hunting, he said softly. Not for me. Not exactly, but for anything that looks like more than he has. Sal lifted her head, measuring the sound the way a hawk measures wind. We can stand here and wait to be found, she said, or we can give hunger a harder question. June looked at Reed, not over him. Come as far as the throat, she said, and no farther. Hear what the valley says when it speaks plain. Reed nodded. He set his palm on the bay's neck. Easy, girl, he told her. We go slow. We do right. He led her like a man who had learned to ask instead of pull. They moved together through the notch and the false green and the wash's long sentence until the lattice stood in front of them like a word they didn't know yet. Leave the mare here, June said, setting her hand on the willow weave. Step easy and quiet and keep your hat in your hand. He did. The throat took him the way a place takes rain that deserves it. The pool's voice widened and lowered. The cottonwoods trembled their green glass, and Rowdy blew a soft hello that sounded like approval. Reed stopped without being told. His face changed. You can tell when a person's eyes have met water that isn't for sale. You don't live in there, he said after a span, as if the idea of such a thing made him shy. We live with it, June said. That's different. She showed him the tin cup and how to lift water like a prayer instead of like a theft. She let him read the rules without saying them out loud. Fire small, paths brushed, shelves kept, the chalkthorn, the horsehair ring warming June's little finger where he could see it and understand a long story in a small circle. Sal stood with her hat in her hands and watched Reed watch the water. There are peaches under the world, she told him, and a map drawn by the dead that will teach you where to stand if you don't intend to break anything. He made a sound in his throat that might have been a laugh and might have been tears deciding not to. I won't break it, he said. I won't tell it. I'll just... He looked for a word that belonged to a person who had mostly traveled on other folks' dust belonged near it. Near June agreed, for now. They walked him back to the lattice. June put her palm flat to the willow and spoke the part that makes the magic work. Small, she said. Quiet, Sal added. Kind, Reed whispered the word, catching on his teeth like a seed husk, and then sliding past of its own accord. He led the bay away with the particular pride of a man who has borrowed grace and intends to return it with interest. Before he reached the knuckle, he stopped and turned, lifting 2 fingers to his brow, in a salute he must have learned from some other life. Then he went along the notch toward the seep and a road that might take years to name. The day didn't break so much as lean. June and Sal moved through the valley's work, the sort of chores that make you the kind of tired no dream can beat. Every so often, wine carried a voice from the east, Pike's laughter run down to wire, then a string of curses that sounded like a man who had tried to yank a door that only opens to hands that know how to knock. Toward late light, a shot cracked twice, then not again, a man trying to make the world startle and failing to enjoy his own echo. Night dropped coins into the pool one by one. Rowdy slept with his nose on his own knee at peace, in a way the world seldom allows. June could have slept a week, but the valley lifted the hair at the nape of her neck once more, and she took her rifle like a broom and went to the blind shelf. Sal ghosted to the wash, a shadow with a mule's patience. They kept watch in a silence that was not empty, but full of duty done in the right size. By moonrise, a figure stood at the giant's knuckle hat, in hands shoulders wrong with stubbornness. Pike smaller under honest stars. He whistled once, a long sound that didn't quite make need, then spat as if the night had insulted him for doubting. June let the water do the talking. Pike paced a while, cussed a while, then kicked at a rock and turned his face toward a darkness that would accept him without improving him. The wash took his prints and laid a long hand over them. The wind, polite as a parson, set about forgetting. Dawn woke the cottonwoods into their green trembling. The 2 black seeds in June's scoops had put on their first true leaves, little hands with fingers ready to hold on. She laughed, and the laugh had the shape of a person who had been measured and not found wanting. Sal came in from the south with dust on her hat brim and sleep in the corners of her eyes and the look of someone pleased by what didn't happen. It'll circle, Sal said, meaning trouble, meaning hunger. But circles lose their teeth if you keep a place the right size. Near June said, thinking of Reed, for now. They opened a jar from the second shelf, not because the day was holy yet, but because it hoped to be. Peaches rose through syrup like lanterns lifted into dawn. They ate with the belt-buckle spoon, 1 fruit each, juice running the old tracks of their wrists. June carried the jar's last peach to the cottonwood with twin scars and set it at the root as if setting down a small sun for the earth to remember. She touched the bark and felt the tree answer under her hand, a long, slow consent. On the stove back where Jonah's letters had scratched their simple proof, June took a nail and added one more mark next to the star that might have been a sneeze. Not to replace anything, not to claim, but to witness. Sal watched, and the corner of her mouth moved the way a person's does when they hear a harmony their ear had been hoping for. Jonah would have liked your handwriting, she said. I learned from water, June answered, and from women who keep shelves. They made the rounds, tin cup lifted and put back exactly where it belongs. Snares checked and reset with mercy in the knot. Seedlings turned a quarter-inch to teach them the sun's patient alphabet. At the throat, they rebuilt the lattice, added 2 new leaves to a lie that had turned honest by doing its job well. Before noon, a 2-note whistle came from far out Reed's shape of sound. Not asking, not bragging, just telling the air he was still circling the right kind of hunger. June raised 2 notes back. Sal added a third that bent upward at the end, a joke Jonah used to play on mornings that had earned laughter. They stood a long while after listening to the waterfall's endless sentence write itself down the cliff. The valley breathed the way a big animal breathes after a run, head high, pleased and quiet. June put her palm to stone and felt it answer. Sal set her hat against her chest and found for a minute a place where grief sat with gratitude, and both were fed. Small, June said. Quiet, Sal said. Kind, the valley said back. Or maybe it was only water, which in this place had learned to speak for all reasonable things. The day carried on. Work followed work. A seed decided the world deserved another try. A horse trod sound on 4 good legs. A boy learned to be near instead of into. A hungry man walked on into a country that would teach him what he insisted on learning. June looked from the cliff across the open and then back into the bowl that had chosen her as much as she'd chosen it. She didn't feel hidden. She felt placed. That evening, as light sifted gold through green, she sat on the cabin step and carved a spoon thin enough to sing when she tapped it. She set it on the shelf beside the tin cup that belonged to everyone who asked right. Under her palm, the wood held the warmth her hand had given it and promised to keep a little for mornings when the water felt especially cold. Rowdy came to put his big head in her lap the way he did when the world failed to be complicated. June scratched the place between his eyes, the small triangle where promises fit. We'll bring some in, she told him, without fear. The ones who knock the way the map says, the ones who want to belong near. Rowdy blew a soft breath. The seeds on the sill lifted their leaves. The water went on falling, and the valley saved and saving kept its oath with them while they kept theirs with it, which is as close to forever as a living thing can live.